Bathed in the merciless, glaring lights of a Capitol Hill committee chamber, it took Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard a mere 15 seconds to methodically obliterate the 4-decade reign of Nancy Pelosi. The spectacle broadcast to millions across the country that morning wasn't some predictable partisan squabble. Rather, it was a historic, clinical annihilation fueled entirely by the undeniable, fatal precision of newly unsealed intelligence records. While it would take a grueling 40 minutes for the former speaker to completely forfeit her legendary speaking cadence, and another 3 for her to forfeit control of her violently shaking hands, her highly public ruin was set in stone by a single catastrophic error in the first fraction of a minute. Striding into the venue with absolute supreme arrogance, the veteran lawmaker acted on the fatally flawed assumption that she still dictated the Capitol's power dynamics. She arrived delivering a monologue at the precise moment when her political life depended on her absolute silence. Initiating the high-stakes showdown with the perfectly choreographed condescension of an establishment insider, she deployed the exact same patronizing smirk she had weaponized for 40 years to politely dismiss her adversaries while publicly invalidating them. Directing her words at the director with a thick veneer of manufactured grace, she superficially praised the officer's military service before issuing a sharply tailored elitist insult, openly suggesting to the room that wearing a soldier's uniform was hardly equivalent to understanding the nuances of running a government. Angling herself a calculated millimeter toward the aggressive flash of the press pool, she projected her voice entirely over Gabbard to the working-class citizens watching from living rooms in Ohio, Idaho, and the Carolinas, audaciously dismissing their genuine struggles as a rural mythology, completely ignorant of the exhausting legislative labor she and her colleagues endured to keep America standing, all while courageous soldiers simply existed out of sight. It was a textbook establishment tactic engineered to humiliate a surging challenger on a national stage, but the optical trap violently imploded when the director took the hit with the chilling, steadfast resilience of a seasoned battlefield commander who had endured blistering deserts and enemy fire far longer than any politician's conceited introduction. Sitting frozen in place at the polished wooden witness desk, she offered no explosive or immediate counterattack. Instead, her palms rested completely flat and unnervingly calm upon a slim, ordinary crimson file that instantly became the undeniable center of gravity in the chamber. Dressed in a sharp, dark blazer accented by just 2 modest military ribbons, the sole silent testament to the war zones she had survived long before stepping into this freezing political theater, she masterfully turned the quiet into a weapon, deploying frightening strategic patience as the former speaker eagerly finished digging her own professional grave. As she finally leaned into the microphone to respond, her voice carried the startlingly sharp, brutally flat cadence of a covert analyst dispassionately reading a tragic body count report to a ranking general. She clinically tore apart the opening statement, ensuring the official congressional transcript reflected that the veteran lawmaker had directly equated serving in the armed forces with a lack of intellect, dismissed the heartland electorate as a fairy tale, and relegated active duty warriors to existing merely elsewhere, while Washington insiders ostensibly did the country's actual work. Executing her moves with the cold exactness of a seasoned prosecutor, she cracked open the crimson folder to expose a freshly unsealed document, its heavy black TOP secret warning brutally slashed out by a single pen stroke, calmly announcing that she wouldn't need to shout today because the absolute ruinous facts were already immortalized on federal paper. Trapping her opponent inside her very own historical record, she pointed directly to July of 2017, forcefully reminding the suffocating chamber of the moment the former speaker stood triumphantly outside the Capitol and guaranteed the nation that intelligence agencies were unequivocal regarding the grave issue of foreign election meddling. When the seasoned lawmaker tried to execute a desperate pivot, her iconic orchestrating hand rising toward her chin in an attempt to manipulate the context of those past declarations, the director severed the political spin with deadly, reporter-like directness, demanding a simple binary confirmation. The exact second her adversary reluctantly conceded the point, The trap violently snapped shut, with the director promising the stunned panelists that before they recessed, she would weaponize the state's own hidden communications to prove how a fake intelligence narrative was coordinated, how a vicious character assassination against a war hero was enabled, and ultimately, how everyone present would be forced to confront one chilling, incredibly specific number, 70. That solitary, hanging digit permanently shifted the tectonic plates of the chamber, erasing the politician's practiced, arrogant grin and replacing it with a shadow of panicked arithmetic, all while 11 quiet, casually dressed combat veterans observed from the back rows, waiting patiently to witness the precise moment the lawmaker's conducting hand plummeted in absolute defeat under the cover of her heavy, leather-bound autobiography. Carter Page is not the reason I am seated here, Madam Speaker. Gabbard pressed on, her cadence unyielding. He served as the convenient scapegoat for somebody else's morning news cycle, but the far more difficult reality is what genuinely transpired within the highly classified chambers where these assessments were actually drafted, which is precisely where I intend to begin. She pulled out the second document, bearing a thick, devastatingly fresh declassification mark. During late December 2016 and early January 2017, a small cadre of career analysts across the CIA, NSA, and FBI received formal orders to generate an intelligence community assessment, the highest level unclassified product the IC releases, which is fundamentally designed to represent the unvarnished, collective, analytic conclusion of three distinct agencies. Elevating the document and scanning the text, she stated, "This constitutes an internal email penned by one of those very analysts on the 4th of January 2017, stating verbatim, the underlying tradecraft does not support the high level of confidence senior leadership has requested be assigned to the central judgment." Lowering the page and locking eyes with Pelosi, Gabbard translated the bureaucratic phrasing into stark reality. Madam Speaker, they were explicitly being instructed on what to discover long before their investigation was complete. A muted wave of astonishment rippled across the press section as Gabbard continued, noting that this was not a solitary grievance, but the documented concern of 7 analysts across 2 agencies whose severe warnings were entirely disregarded in order to artificially elevate confidence levels. The compromised assessment was released, and within 72 hours, Pelosi was at the Capitol microphones, assuring the nation that the intelligence community's verdict was unequivocal, utilizing the specific phrase, "all roads lead to Russia." That became the unquestioned doctrine of her caucus for 3 grueling years, forcefully presenting the IC's judgment as absolute. As Pelosi bristled and her jaw tightened in protest, Gabbard's tone sharpened to a razor's edge, reminding her that unequivocal is a highly precise term, meaning absolutely uncontested. The very assessment Pelosi proudly championed was heavily disputed in writing by its own authors before it even left headquarters. A fact Pelosi knew because the highly classified briefings provided to senior congressional leadership at that exact time, which securely reside in Gabbard's folder, prominently featured every single one of those dissents. Gabbard clarified she was not suggesting what Pelosi merely should have known, but detailing exactly what was physically placed in front of her. Pelosi shifted in her imposing leather chair, projecting immense visceral discomfort, while her conductor's hand remained anchored to the memoir, her index finger betraying a single, nervous, involuntary tap against the cover. "You commanded the most influential caucus in the United States Congress, Madam Speaker, and under your authority, the incredibly cautious, qualified, and internally debated conclusion of a few intelligence analysts magically transformed on live television into an infallible, unquestionable ruling," Gabbard stated. She emphasized that Pelosi was the amplifier who didn't need to write the report because the public simply watched her on the steps and believed her, conditioned over half a century to trust the powerful woman before them. Setting the paper down with a soft slap, Gabbard accused Pelosi's caucus of callously treating career officers trying to do their jobs as mere political assets, shamelessly hijacking their terrifying findings while completely ignoring their crucial caveats, marking the first piece of evidence presented that morning. Pelosi's voice snapped like a whip, declaring that the intelligence community is certainly not immune to scrutiny and attempting to welcome a thorough review. but Gabbard's icy gaze stopped her cold. "I am not investigating them, Madam Speaker. I am investigating precisely what you orchestrated with them," Gabbard countered. The resulting silence was the horrifying sound of a 4-decade legislative giant being mercilessly confronted with an inescapable paper trail sourced directly from her own briefing history. In the second row, a veteran political journalist abruptly finished typing a sentence, packed her belongings, and briskly exited through the rear doors, never to return for the remainder of the proceedings. Gabbard was already advancing to the third section of her folder, noting that while Pelosi was posing on the Capitol steps and the assessment was going public, an entirely distinct conversation regarding a specific phone call was unfolding inside the Speaker's office in September 2019. A whistleblower complaint regarding a conversation between the American and Ukrainian presidents became the explosive catalyst for the first impeachment of a sitting commander-in-chief in over 2 decades, a process Pelosi personally directed by announcing the inquiry and righteously proclaiming from a podium that the truth was marching on. Turning another page, Gabbard highlighted that during the initial weeks of that probe, Pelosi's hand-picked committee chairman, Mr. Schiff, stood before the press and falsely stated no when directly asked if his staff had engaged with the whistleblower before the complaint was officially filed. His staff had absolutely maintained covert communications long beforehand, a deception for which the House formally censured him 3 years later in a recorded bipartisan 213 to 209 vote, long after the catastrophic damage was done. Letting that historical reality settle heavily over the room, Gabbard clarified she was not demanding Pelosi take personal responsibility for a colleague's lies, but rather for the process she announced, assigned, and aggressively defended on every national network. When serious doubts emerged about the chairman's honesty regarding the complaint's murky origins, Pelosi stood before the cameras, dismissed the inquiry as a partisan distraction beneath the chamber's dignity, and ruthlessly bulldozed the proceedings forward. Closing the third tab, Gabbard stated Pelosi had alternatives. She could have paused and demanded the truthful answers the nation deserved before triggering a national emergency, yet she deliberately chose to relentlessly push the political agenda. 3 years later, her own fiercely divided House permanently recorded that the man spearheading the effort had unequivocally lied about its inception. Elevating her chin, Gabbard asserted this was not partisan rhetoric, but the undeniable, documented vote of the very chamber Pelosi managed. Flipping to one more crisp document, Gabbard revealed a foundational Democratic step intentionally omitted. Pelosi brazenly launched the historic impeachment inquiry solely on her own authority at a Capitol podium, explicitly bypassing the mandatory recorded vote of the full House that had initiated every prior modern impeachment. She cowardly denied her own members the vital opportunity to vote on the record before the media narrative gained the unstoppable momentum of a massive institutional process. By the time the formal authorizing vote occurred 5 weeks later, the nation had already been told for 35 days that the inquiry was a terrifying reality, a deliberate procedural shortcut explicitly recorded in parliamentary history. Pelosi, her face flushed with dark fury, issued a stern warning, advising the director to proceed carefully because words matter. Gabbard drove her rhetorical assault straight through the defenses, retorting that Pelosi did not merely bend a parliamentary rule, but actively sanctioned its bending whenever it conveniently served her caucus's immediate demands. She drew a sharp distinction between a genuine leader who bends to the truth and a political operator who ruthlessly bends the truth to meet the frantic demands of the next news cycle. For 40 years, the nation believed it was observing a leader, but some were finally discovering it was merely watching an operator, a realization coming to light that very morning. The chamber fell profoundly silent, even Pelosi's tapping finger halting completely on her memoir, while in the gallery's rear, Gabbard casually noted the presence of 11 decorated veterans in dark suits who came specifically to witness an Iraq War veteran confront the woman who ran the chamber that casually smeared American service members as foreign agents. An anxious aide leaned in to whisper urgently to Pelosi. But for the first time that morning, the formidable speaker seemed entirely incapable of registering the message. Completely undeterred, the director progressed to the fourth tab, recalling that in October 2019, the former Secretary of State and Pelosi's longstanding political ally participated in a podcast interview where she publicly labeled a sitting United States representative and combat-decorated Iraq War veteran as a Russian asset. That malign veteran was Gabbard herself, and the exact transcript of that public record resided securely within her folder. Laying the document flat, Gabbard clarified her intentions. She was not demanding an apology for a podcast Pelosi didn't attend, but rather demanding accountability for Pelosi's complicit silence. Pivoting her chair toward the camera lenses, Gabbard noted that for 6 agonizing years following that smear, Pelosi served as the nation's most senior elected Democrat, appearing on every major network and issuing thousands of statements. Yet, when repeatedly and directly questioned on the record regarding whether she agreed with this horrific characterization of an American veteran by a prominent party member, Pelosi continuously refused to answer, brushing it off as a private matter for Secretary Clinton or a private exchange on a podcast. Gabbard declared it was none of those things. It was a career annihilating label deployed by the most influential Democrat of her era against a uniformed service member, and Pelosi sidestepped it at every opportunity. Maintaining a terrifyingly level voice, Gabbard highlighted the massive toll of that silence. Editors quoted it, panelists repeated it, primary opponents campaigned on it, and the slander followed her into rooms she had rightfully earned access to. It cost her a presidential primary and the camaraderie of honorable colleagues, all because Pelosi, the singular individual capable of ending the smear with one definitive sentence on a Sunday morning, intentionally chose never to do so over 6 long years. As the devastating weight of the word asset settled over the room for a second time, Nancy Pelosi finally regained her footing, her conductor's hand snapping upward from the memoir as her legendary, terrifying voice roared back to life. Unleashing a thunderous cadence, Pelosi spat that she would absolutely not accept lectures on loyalty from a junior officer who selfishly abandoned her party the moment she lost a primary. The former speaker fiercely reminded the room that she served the nation before Gabbard was born, shepherded the Affordable Care Act through Congress with razor-thin margins Gabbard couldn't comprehend at 21, and successfully built, lost, and rebuilt majorities. Pelosi vehemently denied ever using the word asset to describe the director, insisting she did not control her former colleague's speech and refused to take responsibility for a podcast guest's worst hot take simply because Gabbard desperately needed a cartoonish villain in a pantsuit to make her pathetic political calculus succeed. Anticipating the contents of the remaining pages, Pelosi aggressively defended her husband's completely public legal investments, claiming they were conducted at an absolute arm's length from her committee duties, and dared any prosecutor to bring the absurd charges being insinuated. She defiantly concluded that she did not require this lecture and had thoroughly earned the right to avoid it. A fiery counter-offensive that landed with such genuine force, it elicited a collective hum of relief from the Democratic panel, briefly reminding the room that this was Nancy Pelosi, the veteran survivor of countless brutal political wars. Gabbard, however, did not flinch in the slightest. Waiting softly for the echo of Pelosi's outburst to fade, the director calmly clarified that she never accused the former speaker of personally uttering the word, but rather of deliberately maintaining absolute silence when questioned about it on national television, in print, and within that very hallway. Holding the transcripts as proof, Gabbard emphasized that for 6 consecutive years, Pelosi refused to publicly denounce the treasonous label applied to an American veteran, pointing out that she didn't need to police another's speech, only utilize her own, which she explicitly elected not to do. Gabbard categorized this not as a hot take, but as the meticulously documented coward silence of America's most powerful Democrat. Closing the page gently, she preempted any deflection by citing verbatim transcripts securely held in the folder. A December 2019 Politico article featuring her office's cold no comment, a February 2020 Meet the Press interview where Pelosi awkwardly redirected the live conversation, and an August 2021 floor statement where she ruthlessly dismissed a junior member's specific question as immaterial, The pattern was exhaustively recorded over 6 consecutive years. In the shadowed rear rows, the profound tension suddenly broke as 2 of the 11 silent military veterans abruptly stood up, remaining as rigid as stone pillars without uttering a single shout, soon joined by a third. The heavily armed Capitol police officer stationed nearby observed closely but chose not to intervene. For the very first time all morning, Pelosi's right hand entirely lost its rhythmic, orchestrating beat, plummeting to crash heavily against the leather memoir, her fingers spreading wide and trembling, clinging to the book as if anchored to a cliff edge. Gabbard pressed forward, noting that while Pelosi hypocritically dismissed the hearing as a partisan charade, the director fully admitted to harboring a deep personal grievance. However, she fiercely maintained that absolutely nothing printed on those classified pages required her personal grievance to be valid. As the initial frantic intelligence dissents regarding the 2017 assessment were publicly exposed by Pulitzer-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, a man nobody could label a Republican. Furthermore, avowed leftist Matt Taibbi had written extensively on the systemic politicization of the intelligence apparatus, and Obama's acting CIA director, Mike Morrell, publicly confessed the laptop letter was a fabricated political product. Gabbard stated none of these esteemed figures worked for her. They independently arrived at the identical horrifying conclusions because the classified documents dictated those conclusions long before the public learned of them. As Pelosi's trembling hand remained rigidly frozen, Gabbard's tone dropped lower, observing that surviving 40 years in a brutal political ecosystem had taught the former speaker one cynical trick. Whenever a question becomes too difficult, aggressively transform the questioner into the actual story. It was the singular tactical maneuver that constructed every defense Pelosi ever relied upon, but Gabbard asserted it absolutely fails against mathematical figures and physically declassified pages ripped straight from her own briefing history. I am not the story. I am merely the disciplined officer holding the folder, Gabbard declared. The former speaker then muttered a phrase almost too hollow for the microphones to capture, warning the director that she would have her moment, but moments do not last. Holding unbreakable eye contact, Gabbard delivered a devastating prophecy into the absolute quiet. Neither do dynasties, Madam Speaker. The profound statement landed heavily, causing the panicked aide behind Pelosi to stare defeatedly at the floor, while in the back row, 2 additional stoic veterans silently rose to their feet, bringing the total to 5 standing tall. Shifting toward the final, fatal execution of her argument, Gabbard addressed the room, stating they had relentlessly discussed intelligence assets all morning, but she now intended to expose an entirely different variety. She recounted that Pelosi entered the House in 1987 with a congressional salary of roughly $174,000 and had served continuously for 38 years, yet the basic arithmetic of her lifetime earnings, printed on the next exhibit, simply did not align with reality. Turning the final page, Gabbard revealed that Pelosi's personal household net worth, according to the absolute most conservative public estimates published by respected financial outlets, currently exceeds $200 million. Letting the grotesque chasm between a public servant's salary and that staggering fortune hang suspended in the suffocating air, Gabbard noted that nobody in the deeply cynical room believed the wealth was amassed via her government paycheck. The massive figure was built almost entirely upon the hyper-aggressive trading activity of her husband, whose portfolio generated an impossible 70% return last year compared to the benchmark S&P's 24% and a 65% return 3 years prior against a benchmark of 19. Gabbard stressed that a 70% return is not a lucky anomaly, but a terrifying systemic track record, vastly outperforming even Warren Buffett's 20% compound rate, miraculously achieved during the exact years Pelosi wielded the speaker's gavel. Reading rapidly through the trades, NVIDIA, Visa, Microsoft, Apple, Tesla, Gabbard highlighted that the NVIDIA transactions alone yielded violent 7-figure profits. The most controversial was a highly leveraged acquisition of millions in NVIDIA call options in July 2022, aggressively executed exactly 1 month before Pelosi's Congress passed the largest semiconductor subsidy in American history, while lucrative visa trades perfectly aligned with congressional debates over major payment processing regulations. Gabbard clarified she wasn't officially alleging criminal acts within the folder, as none needed to be legally proven for the nation to begin asking sickening questions. Pointing sharply to a graph, she argued it wasn't solely the uncanny timing, but the miraculous accuracy. The household's massive trades were mathematically correct roughly 70% of the time, a feat the absolute best professional hedge fund managers fail to achieve even half the time. Pelosi's family had flawlessly executed this for years, aggressively taking massive positions mere weeks before critical votes the Speaker personally scheduled. Gabbard coldly stated there is a specific word for someone consistently right on sensitive, exclusive information, and it is not lucky. Pelosi's paralyzed hand finally jerked against her memoir in one last desperate attempt to orchestrate a defense, insisting her highly experienced husband built his career completely independently, never consulted her on trades, and she never consulted him on votes. Highlighting the public legal record of their ethical wall, Pelosi challenged Gabbard's malicious insinuations, screaming that there was a reason no formal charges were ever brought. Gabbard, having memorized the kill shot, agreed entirely that no formal charges existed, but exposed the sickening truth every member of Congress quietly understood. The current federal statute simply did not demand the level of legal proof required because Pelosi's own caucus had aggressively and shamelessly voted to maintain that loophole. Every time a bipartisan bill to permanently prohibit this egregious trading reached the House floor, it mysteriously perished. Pelosi's chamber cynically constructed that useless ethical wall and deliberately left the heavy vault door wide open behind it. As Pelosi's hand collapsed entirely in defeat, Gabbard's echoing voice summarized the contradiction. Proudly serving 38 years on a modest public salary while preparing to exit with a private fortune rivaling a regional bank. The fundamental arithmetic only functioned if the public work was absolutely not what it appeared to be. Slowly placing the final damning document squarely between them, Gabbard delivered the ultimate blow. You ruthlessly called me an asset. Well, Madam Speaker, we just found yours. The horrific word, weaponized for the final time, vibrated up to the gallery where an astonishing 8 of the 11 veterans now stood in silent judgment, turning a precise quarter degree to face the camera's red light. Gabbard addressed the millions watching at home, stating that when the powerful woman who spent 4 decades demanding blind trust in Washington's institutions finally departs vastly richer than the greedy bankers she regulated, there is exactly one vital question to ask. How does a public salary miraculously transform into a $200 million private fortune? Until the ultimate answer is something entirely other than this suffocating, arrogant silence, the vital mission of cleansing the corrupt city remains absolutely unfinished. For the very first time in her storied and ruthless career, Nancy Pelosi desperately attempted to execute the one maneuver she had successfully deployed in 1,000 different rooms. She tried to pivot. With all due, she stammered, but the famous rhetorical cadence stubbornly refused to materialize. Her conductor's hand twitched violently off the memoir, failing completely to lift, gasping with all due. Once more, the legendary patrician voice that had authoritatively narrated 4 tumultuous decades of American political history suddenly thinned into something impossibly frail and agonizingly small. It was the devastating, unmistakable sound of an artificial empire abruptly depleting its institutional currency, a total psychological collapse broadcast live in high definition to a nation meticulously conditioned to view her as utterly invincible. Swallowing hard, she attempted a desperate third recovery, uttering Madam Director, utilizing completely the wrong title as naked panic flickered in her eyes. She then tried Major, yet again deploying the wrong designation, her flawless procedural precision and legendary armor completely deserting her live before the entire country. Her vast political intellect had entirely short-circuited under the sheer, undeniable reality of the mathematics and documents sitting on the table. stripping her of the basic cognitive ability to select the proper military address. The agonizing fourth attempt, Sergeant, failed to even produce a verb. Her trembling right hand pressed down heavily onto the thick leather memoir, knuckles turning stark white, as if physically pressing it down equated to standing up and fighting back, though it achieved neither. The highly sensitive table microphone captured the horrifying, amplified sound of an incredibly dry, terrified swallow, while absolutely nobody in the massive room moved an inch to rescue her. 200 people sat incredibly still, forcing the heavy, suffocating silence to belong entirely to her. This silence was not simply an absence of noise. It was an active, crushing indictment, a terrifying collective realization by the entrenched journalistic and political class that the reigning monarch of the legislature had been brutally stripped of her protective garments, leaving her completely exposed to the working class public she had long treated with aristocratic disdain. The terrified political operatives and committee members who had devoted their entire adult lives to violently protecting her flank suddenly recognized the shield was permanently shattered, and the cold, primal instinct of self-preservation instantly overrode decades of enforced transactional loyalty. Rising to her full height, Tulsi Gabbard fundamentally and permanently inverted the room's power dynamic, causing the entire space to gravitationally gather around her. She did not bother glancing down at the crumbling speaker, choosing instead to look past the blinding studio lights directly at the 19 ordinary individuals standing completely silent at the rear of the gallery. Her voice rang out, slicing through the stagnant Washington air with lethal clarity, telling them they came that morning desperately wanting to hear the suffocating word they had lived under for years, finally spoken aloud. She declared it was now permanently etched on the historical record, and there was absolutely nothing more she could offer them in that room. Sealing the tomb on 40 years of unmitigated hubris, she firmly closed the red folder with a sharp snap, announcing that the rest of the matter now belonged to the country. The heavy wooden gavel finally crashed down as the pale, sweating chairman desperately stammered about referring the severe financial matters to the Office of Government Ethics and the classified intelligence issues to the Senate Select Committee for an emergency closed session. He choked out the recess declaration, which landed with the gravity of a prison sentence rather than a mere procedural pause. Instantly, Pelosi's deeply loyal counsel was at her shoulder, physically propping up a legacy that had just evaporated into thin air. The legendary speaker numbly retrieved the thick leather memoir from the wooden table, using both shaking hands, moving agonizingly slowly, completely unable to cognitively determine which side to place it down on, ultimately setting it back exactly where it had been in a loop of paralyzed confusion. Across the sprawling room, the historic morning rapidly disintegrated into chaotic motions, infinitely more humiliating than screaming chaos would have been. Senior Democrats practically sprinted for the side exits without casting a single glance in her direction, executing a brutal, real-time political calculus as they fled the radioactive blast radius of her imploding career, desperately hoping cameras would not capture them in proximity to a woman who had suddenly become a massive political liability. The packed press rows emptied in violent waves, journalists' thumbs flying furiously across glowing screens to fire explosive, raw video clips onto the internet, long before anyone bothered to draft a sanitized written report. Up in the gallery, the 11 veterans had miraculously expanded to 19, joined by ordinary, frustrated citizens in business suits who had spontaneously crossed the carpeted aisles to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. By the time the cowardly recess was announced, 30 citizens were proudly on their feet at the back of the room, their heavy, judging silence unequivocally becoming the loudest, most deafening sound in the entire Capitol building. A veteran reporter near the press table stared blankly at his unwritten notepad, muttering that she never actually gave them the damn answer to the question. An older, gray-haired correspondent watched the shattered speaker pitifully gather her expensive coat and whispered quietly, his voice laced with awe and terror, that she used to execute this exact agonizingly patient tactic and devastating folder maneuver on other people. He noted what a profoundly strange experience it was to watch her sit utterly defenseless on the receiving end. For decades, The mainstream media had been symbiotically complicit in this blood sport, gleefully writing political obituaries for anyone trapped under Pelosi's merciless gavel, but watching the ultimate apex predator become paralyzed prey fundamentally short-circuited their conditioned responses. Out in the marble hallway, former senior aides flatly refused to defend the catastrophic morning on the record, with one nervously whispering off the record that the rampant, deeply unethical household stock trades had severely embarrassed the inner office for years, but the absolute culture of fear had prevented anyone from speaking out. Inside the rapidly emptying hearing room, a breathless communications analyst informed Gabbard that the uncut video clip of the final exchange was detonating across global social media platforms faster than their sophisticated software could measure. The director simply nodded, entirely unsurprised by the digital earthquake. Before departing, she paused at the edge of the wooden table, faced the shell-shocked, half-empty room, and spoke directly into the lenses of the desperately rolling cameras. She projected that many Americans harbored a sickening feeling that the arrogant elites demanding their trust had secretly purchased a luxury country club using their stolen salaries and validated that they were not wrong, nor were they unredeemable deplorables. She affirmed they had clearly understood it all along, despite being relentlessly gaslighted and told they were too stupid to be heard. Looking down with utter, icy disdain at the empty, luxurious leather chair, Gabbard declared her singular purpose was to permanently place on the public record the elite habit of disguising the actual substance of public service with its theatrical costume. She asserted the meager salary is not the massive fortune, the rehearsed cadence is not the truth, and absolutely no one gets to spend 4 decades calling patriotic Americans treasonous assets, only to act shocked the morning someone finally kicks the door in and opens their file. Casually retrieving the plain leather case containing the ruin of a dynasty, she warned that the work was not finished, as there are many other locked rooms and untouchable names in the city that they will be visiting. Tulsi Gabbard walked smoothly out the side of the wooden dais, seamlessly vanishing into the buzzing, everyday noise of the Hart Senate office building, entirely gone before the stunned room could even finish cognitively processing what it had just witnessed. Left behind on the polished table, a heavy leather memoir chronicling 40 years of absolute power sat perfectly closed, with a trembling conductor's hand resting weakly upon it, utterly unable to move. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the Speaker's frantic press office aggressively distributed a heavily workshopped, desperate crisis statement characterizing the morning as a vicious, baseless revenge operation, while firmly noting that the millions in investments were completely public and perfectly legal. It was a slick professional document that absolutely would have succeeded in any prior era, except it collided with one devastating, paradigm-shifting reality. The entire nation had already watched the uncut video showing the most articulate woman in modern political history, humiliatingly incapable of choosing a basic title for the stoic officer sitting across the table. The defensive focus group words on a PR release could never erase the crushing, recorded silence of that hearing room. The traditional gatekeepers of information found themselves completely bypassed. The meticulously drafted spin produced by high-priced consultants proved utterly impotent against the raw, unedited, high-definition broadcast of a political titan visibly collapsing under the sheer weight of her own unchecked arrogance. The American public no longer required a biased cable news panel to translate the event, having personally witnessed the stuttering panic, the trembling hands, and the devastating mathematics of a 70% return on investment, bypassing the spin room entirely. By early evening, the brutal footage had been streamed more times than any congressional clip in history, as furious, reinvigorated critics ruthlessly looped the 70% versus 24% return graphics on split screens across every digital platform. Nervous legal commentators constantly reminded shrinking television audiences that no formal criminal charge had yet been filed, a technicality that absolutely did not seem to matter to a single voter anymore. The massive, invisible social contract completely shattered inside that room would never be reconciled in a sterile courtroom. Deep in Killeen, Texas, a hardened Army veteran of 2 brutal Iraq combat tours, sat bathed in the glow of his television, watching the gallery crowd swell to 30. He remained silent, sitting alone at his scratched kitchen table for a long while before quietly extinguishing the light, his silence born not of shock, but of a grim, terrifying vindication. The abstract betrayal he suffered for years finally possessed a face, an undeniable mathematical figure, and a permanent name, fundamentally transforming his relationship with the government he had bled to defend. In Reading, Pennsylvania, an exhausted woman managing a frantic diner breakfast shift watched her husband silently pull up NVIDIA's skyrocketing stock price on his cracked phone. Having faithfully paid into a union pension for 30 grueling years without ever affording a single share of stock, she said absolutely nothing to him. The crushing weight of that invisible, engineered wealth gap, the sickening realization that the very officials elected to regulate the economic rules had fundamentally rigged them, blanketed their kitchen like toxic fog, replacing decades of blind civic faith with a cold, unforgiving clarity immune to any campaign advertisement. In San Francisco, a liberal bank analyst who enthusiastically voted for Nancy Pelosi every time her legendary name appeared on a ballot for 3 decades, watched the devastating segment alone at lunch, sitting paralyzed by the terrifying, hollow quiet of realizing she fiercely defended a leader who never actually defended her back. This represented the ultimate, unspoken political casualty of the morning, the total, irrecoverable obliteration of the illusion of ideological purity. The tribal loyalties that kept the partisan political machinery operating flawlessly for decades suddenly short-circuited as voters across the entire political spectrum concurrently recognized they had been endlessly financing a highly exclusive, bipartisan country club they would never be permitted to join. The director granted absolutely no glamorous, self-congratulatory television interviews that day when a breathless, pursuing reporter finally cornered her in a dimly lit basement hallway late that night to ask what she ultimately hoped to achieve. Gabbard didn't even break her stride. She offered just one devastating sentence over her shoulder, stating that a powerful woman spent 40 years casually naming other people's assets, and she was simply very surprised that morning to finally be questioned about her own. The Washington political machine is bleeding profusely, but the beast is absolutely not dead yet. The red folders remain meticulously stacked, the classified ink is still wet, and the very next dossier is already waiting to be pulled from the shadows. Whose name occupies the top tab? Is it the untouchable architects of the forever wars who seamlessly transitioned from the Pentagon into defense industry boardrooms? Is it the shadow directors of the intelligence state who illegally aimed domestic surveillance at the very citizens funding their exorbitant salaries? Or is it the complicit media executives who intentionally buried the truth for decades merely to preserve their exclusive access to the rotting halls of power? The structural foundation of the establishment has suffered a catastrophic, unhealable fracture. And as the dust finally settles on Pelosi's completely ruined legacy, the terrified political elite are left staring at a closed red folder, paralyzed by the agonizing, inescapable certainty that Tulsi Gabbard is only just getting started.